taking Sydney property markets pulse. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, Washington latest posts covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And I'm joined again by Chris Bates, mortgage broker, financial advisor, and property whiz. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Martin. Good to see you again.
Indeed, and great time to have a chat. There's a lot of stuff going on, but what on earth is going on? Can you decode the market for us a bit, please?
It's not a buyer problem. If we're talking Sydney, for example, we're talking things that suit, say, first-home buyers or upgraders or families. They've all, because of low interest rates, because the market's been falling, pent-up demand for many years, they've all, after the election thought, well, actually now's a good time. Rates have now dropped. I can borrow money. So they've all entered the market. Unfortunately, though, the sellers are a bit of a delay on that. They're thinking, well, they try to hold on through that whole downturn, and then now they're seeing prices rise. It's kind of like a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Unless they have to sell, then they're like, well, maybe we should wait till next year. We might get a better price, and that's just holding up supply. And unfortunately, what you're starting to see now is it's quite difficult for a lot of my clients, actually. I was just off the phone with one literally half an hour ago. Quite frustrating for them is because every time they go and try to buy a house, and this is in Balmain, they just start going for stupid prices, and they kept getting blown out. And we're just actually renewing their pre-approval to go for another 6 months. But that's kind of the problem. It's very little stock, and there's always someone a bit more desperate than what makes a bit of sense at the moment, and they're the ones who are kind of potentially overpaying or running hot at auction.
Right, and that perhaps explains why in some cases, in some locations, property prices are significantly higher than where they perhaps were. But I suspect that's not universally true, and I suspect if you look in, other areas of Sydney, and particularly where perhaps there is less appetite and less demand, the price story will be then very different.
Yeah, even in good suburbs, there's still properties that aren't selling. It's not to say that everything's selling hot like it was in, say, 17. Poor layouts, dark, busy roads. Weird kind of looking homes. These sort of properties still aren't selling for good prices. Like there was a period prior to the school holidays, and it was a bit of the poorer assets. People were desperate coming up to the school holidays, and they wanted to lock something in before Christmas, and they were selling. But I just don't think it's universal across every asset. I don't think all the new apartments, obviously, we all know about the problems there with the building, and that's just going to keep creating a two-tier market. There is a little bit of even if there is a bit of steam in the market, it can't go forever, obviously, because, there's only, it gets to a point where people they get a bit frustrated and they say, well, I'm not going to pay that. And when the first home buyers start, saying I'm not going to pay X for, then they start pulling out of the market because it's whether it's affordability or the repayments or just a mental shift. So it's because it's coming off a high base, and yes, it's come back. As soon as we get back to what it was, a few years ago, let's say in these premium suburbs, you're going to start to see demand start to dry up again a little bit because people just don't want to take on these big mortgages.
Okay. And what about the bank's lending appetite? Because we see a lot of very cheap loans being offered for certain types of borrowers at the moment, but my intelligence suggests that the hurdles to jump to get those loans are still actually quite high.
I would say that we, as a business, we're not getting any decline loans anymore. Like we got in the Royal Commission, in that we're getting perfectly great customers, perfectly great applications declined because the bank didn't want to take on new customers or something, and it was just unheard of. Like you just didn't know why it was not getting approved. We haven't had a decline loan pretty much all year. In saying that, though, the living expenses issue with all the ASIC and the Westpac case, I think a lot of the banks have just kind of looked past that now and just started lending. Pricing wise, to give you an idea, we just got the biggest discount ever at Westpac last night, like a 1.85 on a home loan, which was just, pretty crazy. And the big four are just, Westpac in this scenario are really just going for it because, obviously their loan books weren't looking pretty in the end of year results. I think that, it is harder than it was, but I think a lot of the brokers have picked up their game. A lot of everyone's kind of now documenting things a lot better. And if your ducks are all lined up and there's nothing wrong with your situation, there's no reason why you won't get money.
Okay. Well, it's certainly a change from a year, 18 months ago when it was very, very tough, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the non-banks, interesting, they're all offering, not that we don't use them, as a first option, but sometimes they're an option, and, the rates they're offering as well. So, like they're not penalising you too much on rates. So, even for people who aren't fitting the big four, etc., they can go to kind of non-banks now, which is pretty crazy for pretty stupid rates as well.
Now let's turn to property investors, because that's of course been quite an interesting sector of the market. There's been very weak growth for the most of this year. Lending, in fact, is still going backwards to property investors. Is there much appetite from that sector of the market that you're seeing, or is it still people staying away?
Yeah, I think it's, when we last chatted, I think we're just starting to see some investors come back. And in the last few months, without doubt, the people who have got homes, just because of the interest rate cuts, and they've been passed on in full for investors on interest only. And so now we're getting like 5-year fixed rates interest only, mid threes for investors. So, whoever, if they have got borrowing capacities and they are thinking, they've been thinking about investment property and they didn't do it in the boom, they are starting to think, actually, maybe I should. And but the process to go and buy a property takes some time. It's a big decision. You've got to go and speak to a broker. You've got to really understand what the right type of property is. So there's a lag on that as well. So even if investors do want to enter, it's not just going to happen overnight. It's going to take 6 to 12 months for a bit of steam to pick up. So I reckon middle to late next year, if without any kind of global crisis, things did survive, things kind of kept ticking on, then I imagine investors will start entering next year.
We're certainly seeing more interest from investors relative to where they were, and more expectations of price growth. So you'd expect them to, come back in. But I agree with you. This is going to be a relatively slow situation. So
it's
I guess then,
how the investors want to see, they want to see returns to come back in the market. The highest portion of investors usually when it's at the top of the market. So like they want to see that things are rising and rising fast, and so they don't invest when it's downturn or things are in a recession, or they really wait till the market's rising. And so even it's not till we start to see 12 months or 2 years of good returns that investors come back, and it's whether we even see that's a different question.
Well, I was going to say the question for me is rentals, right? Because in fact, at the moment, rentals are still going backwards, certainly in many areas of Sydney and elsewhere too. They're well down in Perth. So the economic sort of calculus around returns on investment properties without capital growth really don't work. So it comes back to expectations about future capital growth, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's reflecting on a client I saw yesterday. I mean, he has 4 properties. He's got a little unit in Sydney, and the 4 properties he bought were really, 3 of them were in southeast Queensland, about 45, 50 k's from Brisbane, around Logan, and 3 of them have just gone sideways, and he bought 1 rural that's gone backwards. And this is kind of the common mistakes a lot of investors make, is they'll kind of go to these areas and there's lots of supply, and they, instead of buying 1, they buy 2 or 3, instead of just buying 1 quality asset. And and so I think a lot of investors are switching on, because it's been a pretty scary couple of years, and a lot of people are thinking, do I sell, or markets don't always go up, and there's a lot of kind of myths that kind of been broken, I guess.
So one of the questions I wanted to explore with you a bit today, Chris, was the whole question of property indices, right? And specifically, CoreLogic over the last quarter have basically said property prices in Sydney are up by more than 6%. REA came out the other day and said, no, it's 0.8% over the last 3 months. So I find it quite difficult to reconcile those two statements. So 2 questions. Firstly, have you got a sense of which end of that spectrum is more right? And secondly, do you look at those indices, or is there another way to think about getting to an appropriate sense, maybe a local sense of where property prices? In other words, do these indices really tell you anything?
I think the best way to do it is actually getting out on the ground. If you're trying to track property and think at a macro level, then you're interested in that story. And yes, you can look at all these data points and bring a view, but if you're actually looking at your personal situation, what I should do, then you've got to get on the ground and get looking at properties, go to open homes, go to auctions, be looking at all the past sales, and then comparing in your suburb, like, would this property sold last year for 1.2? Then you've got to actually find the story around that property as well, because there could be a fire sale that could have been under hot conditions that three people really wanted it. So you've really got to go micro if you're really trying to think about your personal situation and get into that market. I mean, for example, like, I know on this podcast, it was all the way through the downturn, I was kind of saying, the quality assets were still getting competition. The problem is now the competition, there's still the same amount of properties on the market, arguably, but there's just a lot more competition. And so when you look at these statistics and you say, well, is it up 6% in a quarter? For me, in those type of properties, it's up a lot more than that. But if you go and look at high-rise apartments around the airport, I don't think there's a 6% return there. I don't think anything really selling. So you kind of, if you were trying to buy in that market, you probably still expect it's gone down. And the only thing that's going to save that market, because investors aren't going to the high-rise market, they've got the picture now, I think. It's just day after day of reading, is first-home buyers under this, 5% scheme, who are kind of getting coerced to come into the market. And because it's a cap on that, they have to buy apartments. And unfortunately, if they haven't been reading the papers and really tracking things, they'll go and buy all these new apartments with defects.
Well, I think that's right. And, there was some discussion in the press today to say, well, why is it that the caps of value are so low in Sydney and Melbourne? And I think you've put your finger on precisely it. They're targeting specific types of properties. Specifically, they're trying to catalyse the sale of this back stock of constructed high-rise that's been built over the last 2 to 5 years. There's more, of course, coming through, because that's probably the biggest hole in the construction sector. But supporting the construction sector by effectively finding those people who perhaps don't fully understand what's going on, to me, is a bit worrisome in terms of what may happen later.
I mean, the state government needs to take responsibility for it, really. I mean, they understand the macro story. The stats are all there with CoreLogic and, the number of off-the-plan sales that sell at a loss, the number that are having problems with settlement risks, the growth of those versus other properties. The government know they're stitching up our younger generation by, forcing them or encouraging them to go down that route. So I think they need to take a bit of more responsibility of what they're doing. But, end of the day, the construction industry is such a big money spinner of the economy. The amount of tax on every single building the government makes, the employment, just the overall kind of activity in an area as well by that building and all the cafes, and it just keeps going on and on and on. By building, there's so much money for everyone, I guess.
And I guess remember also that stamp duty is a particularly large source of revenue for the states. And of course, they've seen that flow of value dissipate over the recent times, quite a significant dissipation in some places. So trying to encourage a little bit of a bounce in that is also, I think, part of the puzzle too.
Yeah, I think Mr. Harry Triguboff got it right actually on the weekend. I read his comments and he said that the banks need to step in here and to basically solve these building issues. They're the ones who are going to be left carrying the can. If the building gets devalued because of defects, because defects get known within the wider public, yes, the consumer loses money, but the majority of those properties have got loans on them, so the banks are going to lose the money. So the banks need to kind of come together here and with the state government and try to bring confidence back. But the longer it goes, the worse it's going to get. So Harry was kind of right there. The banks need to step in here.
We certainly need some sort of set of circuit breakers, because the surveys that I look at from a consumer perspective, a lot of people now are aware of the risks. We also know that there are other people who own these high-rise and want to keep quiet about the cracks that they're seeing, because they're just very worried about if they start escalating it, then it could actually lead to significant value falls, and they could have a stranded asset as a result. So unless there is a circuit breaker, this is going to grind on, and essentially that sector of the market is just going to continue to fizzle away for a long period of time. It's a question, I think, of whether anybody at the political level has got the appetite to really step up, or whether they're going to continue to sort of throw the hot potato around and hope somebody else picks it up.
Yeah, I think they're just hoping on the bandwagon effect just dies, and we all kind of jump on it now, and then we just have this short-term memory bias and 6 to 12 months later, we forget that these were issues and everything goes back to how it was. And I think it's just a bit of wishful thinking, if it's my view.
Okay, so in terms of, here we are at end of November, what's your sense over the next 3 to 6 months? How do you think this is now going to play out, assuming that we don't get an international crisis over the top?
Yeah, I mean, we can always do that caveat. And, we all know 2009, 2008 was a long time ago. And, at some point those things happen. So, caveat that, whether that goes next year or the year after, or who knows what with Brexit or Trump, and there's lots of, big things that are going to happen next year. So let's see what happens there. But let's say that doesn't happen and, the trade war gets resolved and et cetera. If we consider the economy is still going to keep stalling, right? No wage growth, unemployment's not really falling. While the interest rates will be cheaper and people will be encouraged to enter the market, at some point, they're going to want to keep pushing up unemployment or down unemployment. So, it depends what the government does, how far they want to go. Do they bring forward tax cuts? Do they cut to 25 basis points? Do they force the banks to pass on that through, a loyalty sort of investigation, which they're considering? Do they ramp up infrastructure spending? Do they do QE? There's quite a few things that they're probably going to do. The reality is, though, if we do see lower rates and we do see most of that passed on, we are going to encourage people to take on more debt because they're going to be like, well, I'm at this stage of my life and I want a home. And so, and when someone sells a home and they're looking to upgrade, which a lot of people are, first home buyers and upgraders are going to sell for a better price, have more cash. And as long as they're working and, they can borrow the money, unfortunately, because they'll see the interest rate, they'll see that repayment on 3.5% or 3% or 2.5%. And they'll think, can I afford it? And they'll go and take that loan out. It's just human nature. It's what they've always done. And the she'll be right, mate mentality will kick in and you'll see people going out and, pushing up the market. So I think, as lower rates and rates staying lower for longer does create asset price inflation, and that's what I think we'll probably see. I don't think, though, that we probably will see the first home buyer, the building activity in house and land packages start to sell again, which that's good for the government. Whether it's good for the people buying them, I don't think so. But, that'll probably happen. I just don't think that the high-rise market is going to bounce back. And then once the housing market goes up, we'll go into the units and things like that.
Okay, very interesting. So it sounds as though the, cross currents that we're in is making it quite hard to really make some hard calls. And I think the interesting, comment that we got from one of our other contributors the other day, the swagman was talking about the fact that you've got intrinsic value, and then you've got the, the narrative, but then you've also got the political dynamic and, all of those other factors that effectively are influencing. And what you've touched on there are a bunch of political and other factors that effectively are sitting over the top. So this market is not a rational market in a way, because it is being controlled and directed and messed with by both the state and the federal governments.
Exactly. And so if, say, the Sydney market does bounce back, that's going to be, all those kind of, the people who think, oh, property always goes up, they'll be like, oh, yeah, it did. It just had a bit of a blip. And they'll forget about those 2 years. And then they'll take those returns and then, sell them tax-free and then go and buy and borrow and do it again because it worked last time. And so, that's kind of, unfortunately, what will probably happen. But I think there'll just be a bit of a steam run out where once the first home buyers start getting frustrated with housing affordability, which I think is not far away again, they thought they had this kind of glimmer of hope, which they've kind of been looking at the last 6 months and maybe for another 6 to 12 months until they start saying, look, I'm not sure if Sydney's for me. I don't want to be paying, 1.6 million for a little two-better, 6K from the city. Should I move to Brisbane? Should I move to Central Coast? Should I move to Wollongong, Melbourne? And so you'll start to get that real issue that we had in 2017, where people are like, I'm not sure if this is really for me. And that'll take a lot of steam out of the market. Yeah.
Tricky times ahead. Chris, I really appreciate your time today and your insights, because your fingers are absolutely on the pulse. So I really appreciate your time. That's great. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. Good to chat.
Good to talk to you. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.